All right, so these notes are on graphing sine and cosine functions. So now we're actually going to put the information that we learned in the previous notes onto graph paper. But before we start that, let's just start with the warm-up. Go ahead and pause your video and find the amplitude, phase shift, period, and vertical shift for this sine function. Okay, so first off, you should notice that there is a b value right here, so I do have to factor that out. So I have y equals -3 times the sine of, I'm going to factor out the 1/4. So that's x plus. Remember, factoring out is the same thing as dividing out. So I have pi, and then I have divided by 1/4. We don't divide by fractions. We instead multiply by the reciprocal. That's a 4. It looks like a U. So that is 4 pi over 1, which is just 4 pi. So this is 4 pi right here. Okay, so let's get the information that we need here. Our amplitude, this is a sine function. Sine functions do have amplitude. The amplitude here is 3. Our phase shift is left 4 pi because of this right here. Our vertical shift, there isn't any, and that's because there's nothing right here. Our period is 2 pi divided by b. Now, I'm about to divide by 1/4, and I don't like dividing by fractions, so instead, I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal, so that's 8 pi. Okay? All right, so let's get started on how we're going to graph. So let's remind ourselves of what the functions look like first, okay? All of our directions are always going to say graph one complete cycle. So we're going to graph one complete cycle of the parent function. This is with no movement. So first thing that you're going to do is you're going to look to see where the graph starts and ends, okay? So this graph has no phase shift. Actually, let's fill in this first for both of them. The amplitude on both of these, if you look in front of the sine function, there's a coefficient of 1. It's not physically written there, but it's not 0 because then there'd be nothing there. Phase shift, there is none. Vertical shift, there is none. And the period is 2 pi divided by b, where b is 1, so it's 2 pi. Okay, so if there's no phase shift, my first tick mark that I'm going to make is going to be at 0. Then I need to know how long or the length of the cycle. The length of the cycle is 2 pi. So I'm going to go from 0 to 2 pi. That's my last tick mark. You're going to have 5 tick marks total. Now I need the tick mark directly in between. So what's directly in between 0 and 2 pi? That's pi. Now I need a tick mark directly in between those two. What's directly in between 0 and pi? That's pi over 2, or a half a pi. And what's directly in between pi and 2 pi? Now, if you're like, and you're thinking, that's fine, but here's another way to think about it. Remember, it's the middle. To find the middle of two things, I add them and divide by 2. Pi plus 2 pi is 3 pi, and then divide that by 2. Okay? All right, now you're going to you're going to graph the midline. The midline goes through the middle of the graph. You're going to use your vertical shift to show where the midline is. Since there's no vertical shift, my midline is at y equals 0. Okay, now what you're going to do is you're going to use your amplitude to graph tick marks for the highest your graph goes and the lowest. Since my amplitude is 1, I'm going to go 1 above and 1 below. I don't like where 0 is now, so I'm going to delete 0 and just put 0 right there. 1 above and 1 below my midline. And now I'm ready to graph my sine function. So remember, from your sine function, you're going to go to your first tick mark, which is at 0, and you're going to be on the midline. At your next tick mark, you're at the highest it goes. Next tick mark, you're on the midline. Next tick mark, you're the lowest it goes, which is -1. And then the next one, you're on the midline again. So then you can connect those points with a curve, and there's my sine function. There's one thing that I forgot to do that I'll do right now. I want to label this 1 and this -1. Okay? Now let's do the same thing for my cosine function. I need to know where it starts. Since there's no phase shift, it starts at 0. Now I need to know where it ends. The period's 2 pi, so So 0 plus 2 pi, it ends at 2 pi. Directly in between 0 and 2 pi is pi. Directly in between 0 and pi is pi over 2. And directly in between pi over 2 and 2 pi is 3 pi over 2. You should always have 5 tick marks on your x-axis. Now I can draw my midline. My midline, there's no vertical shift, so it's at y equals 0. Now I'm going to show the highest my graph goes. The amplitude is 1. So the highest it's going is 1. The lowest it's going is -1. Now I'm ready to graph my cosine function. So for my cosine function, I'm going to go to my first tick mark, which is at 0. I'm going to go the highest my graph goes. I'm going to be on the midline. At my next tick mark, it's the lowest my graph goes. My next tick mark, I'm on the midline. And then at my last tick mark, I'm at the highest it goes. Once again, I'm making a curve. I like to do those two pieces first sometimes. And then there's my cosine curve. Okay? All right, so now let's graph these with some transformations. So all of these examples here are the direction. Find the amplitude, the period, the phase shift, the vertical shift for each function. Then use that information to graph one complete cycle for each function. Okay, so I'm going to start by finding this information. The first thing I have to do is look to see what the b value is to see if I have to factor it out. The b value is 1 here, so I don't have to worry about factoring out, and I can get started on all of this. Sine does have amplitude. The amplitude here is 2. Phase shift, this is right pi over 2. Vertical shift, this is moved up 1. And then the period is 2 pi divided by b, where we said b was 1, so the period's 2 pi. Okay, so the first thing, like I said before, you have to do is you have to see where your graph starts. This graph does not start at 0. The reason it doesn't start at 0 is because there's a phase shift. So I know that instead I'm going to put down start right here. It does not start at 0. It starts to the right pi over 2. To the right of 0 is positive, and then pi over 2. Now I need to know where it ends. Now let me give you a side example here. If I knew that I was making a graph and it started at -2, and I need to know where it ends, but I told you that the period was 10, let's say, right? That means the length of it is 10. Where would it end? It would end at -2 plus 10, which is 8. So I would know it starts at -2 and it ends at 8. Okay? So to figure out where this ends, I'm going to take the start and I'm going to add how long it is, which is the period, 2 pi. In order to add these two, one of them is a fraction. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make this a fraction by putting it over 1. Now I need a common denominator. My common denominator is 2. So I'm going to multiply this by 2. I'm going to multiply this by 2. This becomes 4 pi over 2. 1 pi over 2 plus 4 pi over 2, this is going to end at 5 pi over 2. So now I know that my first tick mark is going to be at pi over 2. So to the right of my y-axis, I'm going to put pi over 2. Now my last tick mark is 5 pi over 2. I'm going to put it all over as far as I can. So 5 pi over 2 right here. All right, so now I need to know what's directly in the middle. Let me remind you of something. If you cannot figure out, if it just doesn't pop into your head what's directly in the middle, okay, so this right here is directly in the middle, what you can always do is you can add these two numbers, the endpoints, -2 plus 8, and then divide it by 2. -2 plus 8 is 6. 6 divided by 2, 3 is right in the middle. If I didn't know what's in between -2 and 3, I could do -2 plus 3 divided by 2. That's 1/2. So 1/2 is directly in between the middle of those two. If I don't know what's directly in between 3 and 8, I can add 3 plus 8, which is 11, and divide it by 2. So 11/2 is right in the middle, or 5.5. Okay? That's a way of getting it, just so you realize that. Okay, so I need to know what's directly in between pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2. I think this one is just easy to think about. This is what's directly in between 1 pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 is directly in between those two. All right, now I need to know what's directly in between 1 pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. That's 2 pi over 2. But we're not going to leave it as 2 pi over 2 because 2 pi over 2 is simplifiable. These 2's cancel out. So I'm going to say that pi is directly in between those two. What's directly in between 3 pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2? 4 pi over 2. But once again, this is simplifiable. That's 2 pi over 2. So I'm going to erase this, and I'm going to change it to 2 pi. So there are my tick marks on my x-axis. Now, the next thing I'm always going to do is draw on my midline. So if there's no vertical shift, my midline is at y equals 0. But if you look, this is moved up 1. If it's moved up 1, that means my midline is up 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a tick mark up 1. And then I'm going to draw my midline going through it. So here's my midline. This is what the middle of my graph is going to be. Okay, next I'm going to look at my amplitude to see how high my graph goes above that midline. So my amplitude is 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say my graph goes up 1, 2 above and down 1, 2 below. So now I'm going to label the lowest my graph goes, which is -1, and the highest my graph goes, which is 1, 2, 3. I don't have to label this 2, this 1, or this 0, just the lowest and the highest. All right, now I'm ready to graph my function. So I didn't even look to see what it is. It's sine. Okay, so sine, remember, is on, above, on, below, on. So I'm going to go to my first tick mark, which is pi over 2. And I'm going to go on the midline. At my next tick mark, which is pi, I'm going to go the highest my graph goes, above. Then at my next tick mark, I'm back on. At my next tick mark, I'm below the midline, the lowest it goes, so -1. And then at my last tick mark, I'm back on the midline. Then I can connect my 5 points, and there's my sine function. Okay? All right, let's try another one. So notice that we have 4 more to try. They're all a teeny tiny bit different. So if you look at the next one here, first thing I look for is a b value, okay? So notice the b value is 1 again. So let's actually look to see what we're actually doing together. So we have a sine function with the b value of 1, a cosine function with the b value 1, a cosine function with a b value of 1/2, a sine function with the b value of 2, a cosine function with the b value of 2 pi, but also notice that this last 2 are both reflected because they're both negative in front. So I'm giving you everything that you could possibly see, basically. Okay. So b value is 1, so I don't have to worry about factoring out. I can fill all this in. Cosine does have amplitude, so this is 3. My phase shift, this is moved left pi. The period is, oh, sorry, let's do vertical shift next, down 2. The period is 2 pi divided by b, which is 2 pi. Okay, so does this start at 0? The answer is no, because there's a phase shift. So I'm going to say start, and you could always just start by saying, where does it start? And then if there is no phase shift, say 0. You could do that too. Okay, so it is left pi. So left is a negative number. So this starts at negative pi. Now I need to know where it ends. So I'm going to take where it starts, which is negative pi, and I'm going to add the period, which is 2 pi. Negative pi plus 2 pi is pi. So this graph starts at negative pi and ends at 2 pi. So now I'm going to go ahead and put this on my x-axis. I'm going to go as far as I can to the left and call that negative pi. Now, I'm not going to go as far as I can to the right because 0 is directly in between negative pi and pi. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go equidistant from the y-axis and call that pi. That means that I'm just not using any of this right here, just so everyone realizes that. All right, directly in between negative pi and pi is 0. Directly in between negative pi and 0 is negative pi over 2. And directly between 0 and pi is pi over 2. So sometimes your tick marks are super easy. Okay. Now I'm going to draw on my midline. So I'm going to look to see where my midline is. There's a vertical shift down 2. So I know my midline is down 2. So I'm going to go down 1, down 2. And now I'm going to draw on my midline. So people will always ask in class, do we have to draw on the midline? Yes, you should draw on the midline because that's your guide of where your points go. Okay, now I need to fill in my y-axis. There is an amplitude of 3, so that means my graph is going to go 3 above and 3 below my midline. So I already have this tick mark, that's 1. This is 2. This is 3. So the highest my graph is going to go is at 1. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 below my midline. So that is at, if I have to count it, -1, -2, -3, -4, -5. So the lowest my graph is going to go is at -5. Okay, now I'm ready to graph my cosine function. So I go and I make sure it was cosine. It is, okay? And I'm going to go to my first tick mark. For cosine, remember it goes above, on, below, on, above. So at my first tick mark, I'm going above the midline, and I'm going the highest my graph goes, which is 1. At my next tick mark, which is negative pi over 2, I'm on the midline. At my next tick mark, which is 0, I'm the lowest my graph goes. At my next tick mark, which is pi over 2, I'm on the midline. And then at my last tick mark, I'm the highest the graph goes. Now I'm going to connect these to form my cosine function. Notice it's a smooth curve. There's no straight lines. Also, make sure that your pen's not going too far and you're not going up into there because now you've graphed more than one cycle. Okay, and people always ask, like, what if it went a little bit? Make that point bigger. Now you're fine. Okay, let's move on to the next one here. So now we're going to introduce some b values other than 1. So there's a b value of 1/2 here, but I also notice there's no parentheses. So I'm going to throw in some parentheses. Remember, if there's no parentheses, it goes around the x. So if you look, the 1/2 is already factored out. So that's the good news. Okay, now I'm going to get everything else. I need the amplitude. Cosine has an amplitude. It is 2. Phase shift. There's nothing being subtracted or added off of x, so there is no phase shift. Vertical shift, this is moved up 3. So make sure you put those parentheses in the right place, because if you put them around x plus 3, you're going to say that there's a phase shift left 3, which there is not. And then the period is 2 pi divided by b. So I'm going to divide by 1/2, which I don't like dividing by fractions, so instead I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. So the period is 4 pi. So now I'm going to say where my graph starts and where it ends. All right, if you look, there is no phase shift this time. So it starts at 0, and then 0 plus the period, which is 4 pi, it ends at 4 pi. So now people always ask, do we have to show this work? No, if it starts at 0, you could always do it in your head. Okay, so I'm going to make my x-axis, or I'm going to put my tick marks. I'm starting at 0, and I'm ending at 4 pi. All right, what's directly in between 0 and 4 pi? 2 pi. All right, now I need what's directly in between 0 and 2 pi? That's pi. And what's directly in between 2 pi and 4 pi? 3 pi. So there's my x-axis. Notice you will always have 5 tick marks and only 5 tick marks. All right, now for my midline. Let's see, there is a vertical shift up 3. So I'm going to go 1 tick mark, 2 tick marks, 3 tick marks. Now, if you just saw that I shift a little bit, I was actually glancing at my amplitude to see how high I had to go. I have to go up to 5, so I was just leaving room. If you don't have enough room, you could always extend your y-axis. It's just there so that you don't have to draw it in. Okay, there's my midline. Okay, so now my amplitude. My amplitude is 2, so that means I have to go 2 above, 1, 2, and then 2 below, 1, 2. Those tick marks are already there. All right, so the lowest my graph is going to go is 1. Make sure you realize that you're not going to go to 0. And the highest it goes is 2, 3, 4, 5, is at 5. Okay, I'm ready to graph my cosine function. So notice I didn't even look to see what kind it was yet. This is cosine. Okay, so I'm going to go to my first tick mark, and I'm going to go, remember it goes highest on, lowest on, highest. So I'm going to go to my first tick mark, which is 0. I'm going to go the highest it goes, which is 5. My next tick mark, which is pi, I'm going to go on the midline. My next tick mark, which is 2 pi, I'm going to go the lowest my graph goes, which is not 0, it's 1. That's why I label it so I see it. Then I'm on the midline, then I'm the highest my graph goes. Okay, so I'm going to connect this, connect, connect, connect. Okay, so there's my cosine function. Okay, next one here. All right, so what's the b value here? The b value is 2. So I do have to factor that out. So I'm going to do y equals negative sine of, I'm going to factor out the 2. Remember, factoring it out is the same thing as dividing it out. So I have x plus, and then I have to divide pi by 2, so that becomes pi over 2, and then minus 2. So that one wasn't so bad. All right, my amplitude on this, remember it's the coefficient in front of your sine function. I have a negative 1 in front of that, but remember it's the absolute value of that. So my amplitude is 1. You should never get that you have no amplitude on a sine or cosine function. They always have amplitude. All right, my phase shift, this is left pi over 2. My vertical shift, this is moved down 2. The period is 2 pi divided by b, which is 2. Those 2's cancel to 1, so my period is pi. All right, now before I get my start and end, another thing that I notice is that there's a negative right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the word reflect huge right here. I'll erase it when I'm done. But so I remember to reflect it. So it's in my way, and if I don't do it, hopefully I'll see it. Okay, so I need to get the start and the end. All right, so this is moved left pi over 2. There's a phase shift. So left is negative pi over 2. The end, I'm going to put my start plus the period, which is pi. So that's negative 1/2 of pi plus pi, which is pi over 2. If you got that, great. If you're like, what, how? Put this over 1. You need a common denominator. So I'm going to multiply this by 2, it becomes 2. Multiply this by 2, it becomes 2 pi. Negative 1 pi plus 2 pi is pi, and then over 2. Okay. So I'm starting at negative pi over 2. I'm ending at pi over 2. I need the value directly in between those two. That's 0. All right, so I need what's directly in between 0 and 1/2 of a pi. Directly in between 0 and 1/2 of a pi. Or think about what's directly in between 0 and half of a dollar. What's directly in between 0 and 1/2 of a dollar is a quarter, right? So this is a quarter of, not a dollar, quarter of a pi. Now, if you're like, what did you just say? What you could do is you can add 0 plus pi over 2. You can add them. 0 plus pi over 2 is pi over 2, and then divide it by 2. Dividing by 2 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. Pi over 4. Okay? All right. Directly in between 0 and negative pi over 2, negative pi over 4. All right, midline. This is shifted down 2. So I'm going to go down 1, down 2, and then I'm going to draw on my midline. There's my midline. Okay, now I'm going to say how high and how low my graph goes. The amplitude's 1. So I have to go 1 above, that's already marked, which is -1, and then 1 below, which is -3. Okay, now I'm ready to graph my function. So this is a sine function, and it's reflected. So I'm going to remember to reflect it, so I can erase this now. A sine function that's reflected. So what you have to remember about a sine function is usually it's on, above, on, below, on, right? So if you're reflecting it, the only thing that's going to move is that this is going to move down here and this is going to move up here. So a sine function that's reflected, if you have a midline, goes on, below, on, above, on. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. We're at our first tick mark, which is -pi/2. We're on the midline. Usually we go the highest the graph goes, but instead, at our next tick mark, we're going to go the lowest the graph goes. At our next tick mark, we're on. At our next tick mark, we're the highest it goes. The highest it goes is -1. Make sure you don't go to 0, and then you're back on the midline. And there's your sine function. All right, one last one here. This is a cosine function. It's also reflected, so I can write reflect over here really big just to remember. But I'm going to forget that it's cosine, so then I'll look back and see that it's reflected. That's what happens to me every time. Okay, so there is a b value of 2 pi, so I do have to factor that out. So I have y equals -3 times cosine of, I'm going to factor out the 2 pi. That's x minus, and then remember when I'm factoring it out, it's the same thing as dividing it out. So I'm going to divide by 2 pi. When I divide by 2 pi, these pi's cancel, and this is not 2 because this is a fraction 1/2, so that's 1/2. All right, amplitude is 3. Phase shift, this is moved, excuse me, right 1/2. There is no vertical shift. Period is 2 pi divided by b, which is 2 pi. 2 pi divided by pi is 1. All right, now I'm going to see where my graph starts and where it ends. All right, starts. It's moved right 1/2. To the right 1/2 is positive 1/2. Where it ends, 1/2 plus the period, which is 1. 1/2 plus 1 is 1.5, or 3/2. So you could change this to 2/2, and then you get 3/2. Okay, so now I'm ready to put this on my x-axis. I'm going to start at 1/2. So I'm going to put a tick mark here, 1/2. My last tick mark is 3/2, because that's the end. All right, what's directly in between 1/2 and 3/2? So what's directly in between 1/2 and 3/2? 2/2. But I'm not going to write 2/2 because 2/2 is 1. All right, now I need this tick mark and this tick mark. So what's directly in between 1/2 and 1? A lot of people will just think and they'll say, oh, that's a half and a whole, a $half and a whole dollar. Well, that's 75 cents or 3/4. But if you can't think that way, you can pretend this still says 2/2. And you can do 1/2 plus 2/2, which is 3/2. And then remember, take half of that or divide that by 2. I don't divide by half, divide by 2. I multiply by a half, multiply by the reciprocal. That's 3/4. So there's many different ways to think about it. Same thing here. If you don't know what's directly in between 1 and 1.5, which is 1 1/4, which is 5/4. But if you don't know what that is, there's a bunch of ways to get this. Same thing, you can say this is 2/2. So you can do 2/2 plus 3/2, which is 5/2. And then divide that by 2, which is the same thing as multiplying by half, which is 5/4. That's one way. That's the second way. Just knowing it is the first way. Doing that is the second way. A third way is that this was already a fourth, right? 3/4. So if you think about it, this is 2/4, this is 3/4, this is 4/4, this has to be 5/4, this is 6/4. Okay, but you want all your fractions simplified. All right, I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm not going to get rid of it, but I'm going to move it out of the way. Okay, now I need to draw my midline. There is no vertical shift, so my midline's at 0. So I'm going to draw my midline on the x-axis. Now I'm going to use my amplitude to say how high and how low my graph goes. The amplitude's 3, so I'm going to go up 1, 2, 3, and label that. Go down 1, 2, 3, and label that. All right, now I'm ready to graph my function, see which I forgot what it was. It's cosine, and it's reflected. So I can erase the word reflect here. Don't need it. It's cosine, and it's reflected. So recall, if it was cosine not reflected, you go the highest it goes on, the lowest it goes on, the highest it goes. So a reflected cosine graph is going to be the lowest it goes on, the highest it goes on, the lowest it goes. All right, so let's do that. We're going to go to our first tick mark, which is 1/2. And since it's reflected, we're going to go the lowest it goes. Our next tick mark, we're on the midline. And our next tick mark, we're the highest it goes. The next tick mark, we're on. The last tick mark, we're the lowest it goes. Go ahead and connect. Remember, that's like the outside of the unit circle, so it shouldn't be bent in the other way. It's like the bottom right-hand corner. Ooh, that's not pretty. Oh, that's not very pretty either, but I'm trying. And there we go. And there's your cosine function. All right, that's it for graphing sine and